Well, welcome everyone. We are excited that you are all here. This is week 2 of our summer formation series on Wednesday nights at 7. Y'all know that because you're here. Our series is Great is Thy Faithfulness, talking about God's covenants. This week we're discussing the covenant with Noah and the story of the flood. This is Genesis chapter 9, 1 through 17. We'll actually be looking really starting in chapter 6 briefly to get a little bit to ground ourselves in the text. As I said, this is being recorded so that we can share it with our people who aren't able to make it this evening. But we are so glad that all of you are here. We want to make sure that this is, we've got a really nice sized group tonight so that, I'm going to talk a lot, but y'all are probably sick of me talking. So please interrupt with questions or comments, disagreements, whatever you got. I would love this to be interactive and participatory. So here we are. The first thing I want to do is just sort of talk about what is a covenant. And Dr. Barbara Tita did that really well last week, talking about the general idea, especially based in the Jewish tradition. But the way we get the word covenant in the English comes from the Latin verb convere, which really means to meet or to come together. And it establishes a community of some form. And when we're talking about biblical covenants, God really chooses to enter, God chooses is the first important part, to enter into a relationship with us. So sort of God claims the people so that the people can claim God. And Dr. Tita talks a little bit about the different types of covenant that we see in the Bible. And in the Hebrew context, the word comes from the Akkadian language, and it means to fetter, which I was looking up, and the definition technically is to restrain with chains or manacles, which doesn't sound very pleasant, I will say, but because when we think about covenants with God, it's an uplifting, almost a way of honoring. God is honoring us by lowering himself or God's self to us. Most of the covenants within the Old Testament are modeled after a Hittite and Assyrian tradition. So you'll see a lot of parallels to that in ancient cultures. And we'll talk about sort of some of the parallels to those cultures a little bit with the flood narrative this week. Covenants are oftentimes where a superior party makes the covenant with an inferior party. In the Assyrian and Hittite tradition, that was definitely sort of in a political realm, a larger dominating state with a smaller vassal state. Or in the biblical sense, it's really God is making a covenant with us. We are the inferior ones. And also, Dr. Tita highlighted the 2 types of covenants. One is promissory, and the other one is obligatory. Promissory, which I think the covenant of Noah and the covenant with Noah and his family, this is where it falls under. This is where covenants are made with the ones that God loves, God's beloved people. We'll also see this with the covenants of Abraham and David. In the promissory ones, we don't have to do a lot. And I think Dr. Tita did a great job of sort of alluding to this do you even see the side of the inferior party even accepting the covenant? But it's just there. So we'll see a little bit of that with Noah as well. The other one, the second type of covenant, the obligatory covenant, is the best example is the covenant with Moses at Mount Sinai when the Israelites received the law. Some of the commands are, you will obey or uphold the law. And we see that in a lot of the literature in the later Old Testament about that is their responsibility to uphold the law. I would love, before we sort of get into some more content, if we would actually read the scripture. And since we have so many wonderful voices here, oh goodness, I closed out the wrong screen again. I would love if we could have 2 people read our scripture. I need a bigger screen because this is so frustrating sometimes. All right. If someone would read Genesis 9, 1 through 7, and then someone could read 8 through 17 on the next slide. I don't know if y'all can see that. Anyone is, it is open to all.
I can read some.
That'd be great.
All right, so just what's on the screen right now.
Yeah, that'd be great.
It's kind of cut off a little bit, so it's the NRSV, right?
Yeah.
So 1 through 7.
Yes, that'd be great.
All right. God blessed Noah and his sons, and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest in every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food to you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. For every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall the person's blood be shed. For in his own image God created humankind. And you, be fruitful and multiply, abound in the earth and multiply in it."
Thank you, Chris. Would someone read 8 through 17? It's now on the screen. Y'all can see it.
I'd be happy to. This is Joan, right? Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again be a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth."
This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. Wonderful. Thank y'all so much. Before we jump into the actual text that is for this week and that will be preached upon in worship on Sunday, I kind of want to start a little bit before, and by a little bit before, I really mean 3 chapters. The story of Noah and the flood is, as scholars nicely put it, it's pretty problematic, and one person put it as pretty impossible. Because the story of Noah starts in chapter 6 and goes through 9, and chapter 10 is really the genealogy of Noah's descendants until it leads us up to the Tower of Babel. And within that is the larger flood narrative. And the flood narrative, as many of y'all know, is a really common sort of style, oftentimes associated with creation or creation of a new era in ancient civilizations. Most of the ones that people point to is from the story of Gilgamesh and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there are a lot of elements within our own story of the Bible. We'll talk about birds a little bit that mimic the Epic of Gilgamesh. This upsets some biblical literasts. And as one scholar said, the story of a universal flood for the world has employed many amateur archaeologists for many years, which I thought was kind of funny. I won't go more into that. That is not my area of expertise, Mesopotamian myth, but just wanted to highlight that aspect, that this story is just, a large aspect of a lot of sort of culture that is informing this time period. But the problem and a lot of the confusing parts of the story of Noah is that it's really two accounts into one. The flood narrative is sort of a primary text that the scholars have pointed to, that there are multiple sources that influence the Bible, especially when we were talking about the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Another place that we see this, where it's sort of two accounts rolled into one story, is the story of creation. In chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, it's a little bit better divided out. In Noah, they really sort of weave the sources in and out of each other. I was reading something and they said, if you read this story, what would you understand about God? And they said, God is a God of repetition, because you'll have, God orders to the construction of the ark. Noah constructs the ark. Then what happens? God orders the construction of the ark. No, did Noah construct 2? No, it's just different, different sources. I'd love if you would give me the grace to briefly highlight the 2 sources that we're dealing with. There's really about 4 kind of main ones that we talk about when we discuss source criticism for the Old Testament. The 2 major ones that are sort of at play here are the J and the P sources. And the J is also called the Yahweh source. The reason we spell Yahweh with a Y, but the Germans spell it with a J, German scholarship influenced us, so we call it the J source. It's given that name, and it's really because in those references, God is referred to as Yahweh. You'll see in the Old Testament when you have L-O-R, Lord, all caps, it's to signify, that's the difference between saying the Lord as in a sort of royal title, or God, which is the generic term for God in Hebrew, which is another sort of indication of source. So that's the J source, and its style is a bit more clear. I don't want to say primitive in terms of the style, but there's a lot of discussions about sort of God has a lot of human qualities when you're looking at the J source, which also comes to play a little bit, but it's much more clear and distinct and succinct. The other one, as I mentioned, is the priestly source. This shows up when you were reading the Pentateuch and there's a lot of dates, or the addition of dates, addition of genealogies, but especially the law. Anything that's to do with the priestly tradition, their role in society in terms of offerings. If you see this long sort of addition about offerings in what is sort of a simple story, you could think it might be part of the P source, the priestly source. A lot of what we've seen the P source contribute to the Pentateuch is really like Exodus 25 to Numbers 10, so that's all of Leviticus, that's all has to do with the law and the sort of the holiness, the practices of the priests. So we won't get too much into it. The Harper Collins Study Bible, that's always one of my favorites. It does a really good job in its notes about highlighting which aspects of the stories, really in chapter 7, 8, which come from which source. I just thought I won't torture you with text criticism or text comparison. I would do that to the young adults. So they get the brunt of that. I will spare you of that right now. But any questions about sort of the different sources? And these are, as I said, only 2 out of 4 that we sort of point to a lot. Were any questions about covenants so far? All right. Let's see. So the there's there's a lot of issues with the story. There's the repetition, but there, I do want to highlight, as I said, we're not going to do text criticism, but I just want to highlight some interesting aspects of the story of Noah that sometimes we actually forget or overlook because we're so used to sort of, when it says, do you know about Noah? Of course I know about Noah, and the generic story, but there are some unique things. One is that Noah's commanded to build the ark, and in the P source, the priestly source, he has to take one pair of every animal. But in the J source, Noah is commanded to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals. There's a lot of debate as to the reasoning behind why one source wanted this, but the difference is, so when I see representations of the ark and it's 2 little elephants, 2 giraffes, 2 lions, it's more like 14 elephants, 14 giraffes. Makes it even sort of a more impossible story as we think so. There's also a huge issue of time in the story, and I think most of us here understand that, especially with the Old Testament, in terms of some of these creation histories, is we are able to suspend our, a literal understanding of time. But on one hand, this just goes into sort of the problems of the text. On one hand, there's this really nice year-long sequence of events. The flood comes on the 17th day of the 2nd month of Noah's 600th year. We're not even talking about that. The water rose for 150 days. That's in Genesis chapter 7, 24, and that's about 5 months. And then the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, that's in Genesis 8:4. On the 17th day of the 7th month, that's when it rested on the mount. And then on the 1st day of the 10th month, the mountains appeared. And then on Noah's birthday, the 1st day of the 1st, it goes on and on. It really, I don't have a slide for this, but it's impossible to follow as I read it aloud. But this is all well and good. And, and we see that time is really unaccounted for, but there's also the famous 40 days and 40 nights that's in the middle of both of these sort of time frames. And it's mentioned in chapter 7 and chapter 6, but it's also coinciding with the 1st day of the 10th month. Thus, some scholar figured out 40 days became 7.5 months. Those are, maybe that's a day in quarantine where it just feels like it goes on and on forever. I guess if you're trapped on an ark with, 7 or 14 giraffes and 2 pigs, that could be how 40 days becomes 7.5 months. But then there are other ways where the 7 days in which Noah waited for the dove to return, and there are also 7 days after that. So the timing just, again, it sort of points to some issues of the sources, that it's not just a pure clean story, but really what in the Bible is just sort of succinct and so clear. But one of the other things I would love to highlight, just as I like the story, is, and this is where I was alluding to, is there's always the bird we forget in the story of Noah. In the first account is Noah sends out a raven, who one scholar said, he did his job well, but we always forget about the raven. But we always remember the dove who was sent out multiple times and was able to bring back the olive leaf. The story in Gilgamesh, which just sort of paralleling it to other cultural influences on our Old Testament, is that I think in Gilgamesh it's a raven, a dove, and a swallow. So who knows, at one point, maybe in an oral tradition, that our flood narrative and the story of Noah had a 3rd bird. I'm sure someone has written a dissertation on the representation of 2 birds in 3 weeks. Maybe we forgot the 3rd bird, but let us remember the raven if we aren't going to quote him. But let's jump, before we jump to the quote, the covenant, I want to read chapter 8, verses 20 to 22. See if I can do this succinctly. Hold on, I'll put it up the screen and I'll just read real quick. This I really think is a big crux of the way we see, and it shows a lot about God's personal action within this narrative. So when Noah built an altar to the Lord. This is after they've landed on the mount and they're able to leave the ark after the world has dried up. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Excuse me, let me get out of that. These screens are y'all there? Oh, there you are. Sorry. I thought I closed the meeting. I do apologize. Hey, I learned how to do a poll, but goodness, I'm struggling. Anyways, I really like that text because we see there, especially in verse 21, this is where it seems like God has had a change. And when we are talking about, we proclaim that God is unchanging, what does that signify about our understanding or what we claim about God? But I do think it's indicative of what we'll discuss about the uniqueness of Noah's covenant that a lot of times we don't see in other covenants, is that God is almost making a covenant with himself in this. And then in chapter 9, we see that God is making a covenant with Noah, repeating it, almost making Noah, I would not take this literally, but almost Noah is more like a witness than almost a participant in the covenant, because Noah doesn't do a lot after this. So why did God have to make this? I mean, God, as we know, the world was wicked. In one situation, the reason God is wanting to destroy it is because they say that humanity is completely wicked. But then in another source, they talk about how all flesh is wicked. And there's an implication here that it's not just that there's violence amongst humans, but there's violence amongst animals, which if we're looking at sort of the creation story, this was also supposed to be, it's talking about a perversion of the whole creation, not just of humanity's wickedness or sin. So that's going to come into play a little bit, but we see that in I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclinations of the human heart, evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. So that's verse 21 in chapter 8. So we see him specifically mention the wickedness of humankind, but then again, they do specifically mention, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. There's significance in, as we know with God, is he could have struck down all humans without doing the animals, but he struck down all the earth. He had to preserve humanity with Noah and his family, but he also had to preserve sort of these clean and unclean creatures within the ark as well. So I think there's significance that we want to sort of hold that while we move forward. Any questions about that?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Yeah.
When I was reading the story before we came together, I definitely had also noticed how God was like creating a covenant, like the rainbow is to remind him of the covenant. Like I just kept seeing that and over and over again. I didn't even really see that much about it being for Noah, but it was like God was saying, when I see the rainbow in the clouds, I will be reminded that I will not destroy the world by water again. And so, but yeah, so like when you were talking about the covenants, that was it, the Promissory Covenants?
Yeah.
that's like kind of was a promissory covenant for like God and not just for us.
Absolutely. That is dead on. And I think that's sort of like how we say, we forget about the raven, we've forgotten about, 7 pairs. That's one thing, is that the rainbow or the bow in the heavens is a reminder to God. And we've sort of say, oh, it's a reminder to us of the covenant with Noah. That's absolutely dead on. And that's going to be extremely important when we talk about the significance of this covenant. So thank you so much for pointing that out.
You're welcome.
This is Joan. I'm a little curious though about just in the sequence of how God breaks covenants, or we break covenants with him. And just, curious. Last week was kind of disturbing. As we heard Rabbi Barbara talk about her, her faith. So you don't necessarily need to comment on this, but it's, my limited Bible teaching was, once God makes a covenant, it's forever. And then now what's fascinating in this Bible study is that we will choose to break covenants. God will choose to break covenants. So I'm just so used to covenant being once and for all.
Jen, I am a much more of your sort of perspective, is that whenever God needs to make a new covenant, it's because of something we've done. Either, I would say, like with the Israelites, with the covenant with Moses, as we'll discuss in 2 weeks, when the reason it fails, and, well, actually this goes into more even Hebrew 8, is it's because of our failings that God has to make another new covenant, that one in Jesus Christ. But even between sort of the Moses and the Abrahamic covenant, for me, it's much more that God has never broken a covenant. And I think that is a big difference between maybe a Jewish and a Christian perspective.
Well, this is Cheryl, and it seems like to me that each covenant had its own place as well. I mean, there was this covenant with all creation, with the animals and the humans. And then with Moses, with Abraham, it was with a single person through whom God would work his purposes. And then he creates a nation when he brings people together through the Mosaic covenant. And then with David, he's looking forward to a future time when another king is reigning. So it seems like to me that I agree that I don't see that God breaks covenants, but that God moves with and evolves with the people as they evolve and as they mature. So he's present at all times and makes God self-present in different ways, in consistent with what they need at that moment.
Thank you.
Before we, I think, jump into the chapter 9, it's that scripture, I want to see, do y'all see, the verses we read in chapter 8, 20 to 22, where the Lord smelled the burnt offerings, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground. Do you see this as God changing, or is God just changing God's mind? Can you separate the two?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure. Robert, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. I mean, one of the big things I take comfort in is that God is unchanging. And I think we see that in the covenants, that God does not forsake a covenant. That's my perspective. But here we have God's wanted to wipe out all of humanity except for this small portion. And then all of a sudden, God smelled the pleasing odor and said in his heart that he won't ruin the earth. So is this God changing, like God's character, God's person is changing, or is it just sort of a decision?
Well, for me, I kind of think of it, I was just realizing that maybe it's not God changing or God changing his mind. It's that God realized that Noah has changed his mind and changed the way that he's going to be living on earth, which means that like Noah will be teaching the people that come after him like what God did, the promises that God made, the covenant, and the desire to continue worshiping God. Like I kind of seem like since God knows everything about us, that God was the one that saw Noah's change and then was like, yeah, I will create this covenant with you.
Beautiful. And we do have other instances within the Bible where people have negotiated with God, and God has acquiesced.
Robert, this is Barb. I sort of think of it as God has all power, all, there's nothing he doesn't have. And he's in his own mind says, I've got to restrain myself when it comes to these humans. They're not that strong, or they're pretty weak, and I realize I can't wipe them out. So it was not, I guess it was him, God, deciding that there needed to be some restraint on God's part when dealing with us.
Absolutely. And keep that idea of restraint, because that's going to be a big part of what we talk about in a little bit. Thank you.
Robert, this is David, and I come at this in a slightly different perspective. We've got this story of creation where it's all good and man is very good. Being made in God's image, that's a great blessing. Man is expelled from the garden, and one of the punishments from that is that he will die. Noah is the first man in recorded history that understands what that means, in my opinion. He is the first man that was born where natural death had occurred. And therefore, when God looks and says, let's see, back in, where's that, 6? The Lord saw that wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts and hearts was only evil continually. But Noah found favor in God's eyes. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. God sees that 1,000 years of this wonderful creation turned sour. I mean, it's pretty clear that, literally the vast majority of humanity is evil. Now, Noah, having been born in a world where natural death has occurred, understands God's promise that man will die. So I think he has a different relationship with God, and is probably why God selected him to build an ark. And then when the rest of humanity has been destroyed, you have someone who's blameless before God to kind of restart. This is a recreation story. So when we talk about creation stories, they're too early in the book, but here's another one. And one might consider the Exodus a creation story or recreation story. So I just kind of look at this as God seeing some hope in his creation through a man.
I mean, absolutely, David, because they talk about, in some scholarship, they've talked about Noah as the new Adam. I mean, we use the term the new Adam as well in the New Testament, but that this is and there's significance in just even 9:1, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This is the sign of, that's sort of phrasing that is traditionally used for a new era. Mm-hmm. And so you're exactly right that this is another creation story, and and I think it's reflective of what God is that Noah is just one spark of righteousness, one person in all of the world who is pleasing in God's sight. And God is willing to take that and rebuild creation, give us one more opportunity. Now, the flip side is he did completely destroy the earth, but, I think what you've said is absolutely dead on. Anyone else?
Okay, Rich here, and one comment, kind of when Barb was saying that God is all powerful and can, I like to say that it's not he can't destroy the whole world. He decided not to completely destroy the whole world. Is that he can. So I just look, especially at these prehistory things, through chapter 11. I look for the big main ideas. What is this I'm supposed to learn about God from this? I'm going to go big picture, but God despises evil. Okay, that's pretty clear. And while God is all powerful and can destroy us all, I like to look at the one remnant preservation here that he chooses not to. He says, okay, I'm not going to destroy everything. I'm going to work through, here's something I can work with. I can work with this guy. I can work through him. And so in some crazy way, I think that he's not necessarily changing his mind, but expressing himself differently, saying, I could, but I'm not going to destroy everything. Even now through Noah and later on, I'm promising I'm not going to destroy everything.
I love that. I mean, it is consistent with a God we know in the Old Testament and the New, but not. Say that one more time. You said God is not changing his mind, but revealing him?
Yes.
You said it well.
I can't recreate exactly the same words, but yeah, he's revealing himself through he could destroy everything, and he's showing you, but I'm not going to. I'm going to work with this. I'm going to work with this creation, with these humans that I've created, with these flesh that I've created, and I'm going to redeem it.
Absolutely perfect. God is revealing God's self in a new way. Fantastic. I vote I've got lots more questions and lots more. This is why I don't understand an hour. We'll briefly go sort of line by line, but I mean briefly, and sort of jump around to some of the major points, because I love that we have a great discussion going on, so I don't want to dissuade that, but I thought I've done enough pre-work before the text, so we might as well actually address the text that we're supposed to be doing. As I said, for chapter 9, verse 1, this is really this wording of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We'll see that again with Abraham, but it signifies a new era that, and as David said, this is a new creation. We talked about the ties between flood and creation, and again, a lot of scholarship talks about Noah as the new Adam who will repopulate the earth. Verse 2 and 3, it follows really the second creation account about how Adam was formed actually before the animals of the earth. and the animals are underneath humanity, and we have dominion over them. Most importantly is that humans were actually not allowed to eat meat. In Genesis 2, it says, I'm always terrible about direct quotes, but God offers you can eat all the fruit of the trees here, but he doesn't talk about eating animals. And part of the wickedness of humanity, it's alluded to, is that humans and Adam were supposed to avoid eating meat. It's really avoidance of the violence that is involved in sort of meat eating. I mean, I have bacon, so I'm not, that's just a comment, statement of fact, not a judgment. And as I said, this is part of the wickedness. And there's even someone went as far as to talk about how, like, maybe it was animal on animal violence. Like maybe even the lions were supposed to be herbivores. And you could talk about Isaiah where the lions are eating straw, but that's a big jump. I was working with Isaiah earlier, and I was like, oh look, not good scholarship, just my musings. Now in verses 4 and 6, we do see certain restrictions about meat eating and violence. We can't, it does outline, and this is sort of a very severe, the wrath of God of the Old Testament, the angry God of the Old Testament. We kind of see that some of the wording here is that you can't kill human, and it's on the penalty of death, because, and this is I think a really wonderful tie to creation, but part of this covenant that's included is that humans are made in the image of God. That's part of this covenant that we are reminded of. And then verses 8 and 10, this is really where we have our covenant. As for me, I am establishing As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth, with you as many as came out of the ark. God in this covenant is going beyond humanity and to all of creation. And I think that's really unique for this. God makes, in verse 11, God makes a promise not to destroy the earth by the waters of the flood. That's the language we're very familiar with. And then verse 12 and 13, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, the bow is seen in the clouds. I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy our flesh. Even in 16, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant, which Chris was wonderful to identify and point out that this is all talking about God. It is a marker, a seal of the covenant, but it's for God, that God is using it to remind God's self. I really like the image of a bow. We've, talked about a rainbow, and it's on our logo for this series. But here, the bow is a weapon of war, and I like to almost think of God as a warrior who's retired. He is hanging up his bow in the sky, never to be used against us or to be at war with his people again. Again, I think this can be tied into the way God is revealing God's self to us. And then the other thing I just wanted to highlight is in verse 15 and in 16, we hear the word remember. For the Hebrew here comes from the root zakar, and it works really well with remember in our context, and I think in poetically, literature-wise, remember is the best thing. But really in this context in the Hebrew, it almost is closer to enact or fulfill. That by hanging up my bow, my weapon, I cannot use it against you. I'm fulfilling the covenant by getting rid or releasing that from you. So just, sort of to recap, what has changed after this covenant? Honestly, for humanity, we're now allowed to eat meat. It is very apparent that we are not allowed to shed human blood. Sort of the blood signifies life. human on human violence is banned. And it is specifically said because we are created in God's image, which is something I know we talk a lot about, especially in the conversations of today, that everyone has value because they are all created in God's image, filled with the Spirit. But the most importantly, as Barb said, is restraint. This is a covenant, I think we can say it's promissory because Noah doesn't do much to receive this covenant. But really, this is God restricting God's self. God is restraining God's self, promising never to destroy all the flesh. And I think this is really unique from our typical covenants when sometimes there's an exchange of some sort. But this is a unilateral divine decree that rules out the destruction of the world. And it's a self-restraining order. And I think, as Rich really well put it very well, is it's a new revelation. And again, this is a covenant with creation, not just with a person or a people, like we will see going forward. That's a lot. Are there other, we sort of highlighted some of the unique aspects of this covenant. What are aspects of this covenant that stand out for you theologically or personally?
This is Chris. When I was reading the whole thing about the reckoning of let's see. For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal, I will require it. And from human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. I kind of thought of that as what goes around comes around. When I was talking about if a human is killed, that human that killed the human will be killed. And so that also kind of reminded me of karma a little bit, of when you do something towards one entity or spiritual something, it'll come back and harm you later. So yeah, I kind of made that little connection. I don't know if that's something that could be made, but I had to look up what reckoning meant. It's talking about settling of accounts is what I saw. So it's when you create that debt of removing somebody's life from the earth, that your debt gets repaid by you losing your life. So I don't know. It seems very harsh, but yeah.
I think that's a wonderful point, and highlighting that reckoning idea kind of goes into the idea of what a traditional covenant almost does, the exchange. Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful insight.
It's also, that idea is also a lens for seeing the cross. It's not a direct doctrine, but it's a way to perceive that reckoning and the blood being given.
Yeah. Taking it to the future, Gerald.
I think it's also, when I was thinking about this big picture, God saying, okay, I'm not going to destroy everything. I didn't just this time. I almost did, but not completely. I didn't destroy everything, and I'm not going to destroy everything. He's kind of turning that back on us, saying, so don't you destroy it. Don't you destroy these people. Don't you destroy this creation of mine. And it puts a lot of responsibility on us, I think, in that sense. Another corollary of this way of thinking is that God could have just zapped everything to be perfect, and it wouldn't be the same world anymore. But he says, no, I'm going to work with this world, with these people, and you're going to have to keep working through these hard things. It's going to be up to you. I don't want you to destroy it. just like I didn't destroy it.
That's very reformed. We got to work. So there is some sort of exchange on our behalf, you know, even if Noah's rather passive, there is an implicit aspect of that.
Mm-hmm.
What are the implications for us that God made this covenant with all of creation, not just with humanity?
I mean, maybe like as we've been saying that Noah was like the new Adam, and Adam was like created with all of creation and being like over all of creation, it kind of could be like Noah has the same kind of responsibility of like reminding his predecessors that God is watching out not just for people but for creation as well. So it's kind of like just as Adam and creation were dedicated to God, now Noah and creation are rededicated to God.
Absolutely. And Noah remained righteous in the eyes of the God. Now his children, on the other hand. Anyone else?
Well, this is Nancy.
Hey, Nancy.
Hi. I kind of look at it, I see what everyone has said, and I don't disagree, but I'm looking at it from the standpoint that these people are trying to figure out their world. And I look at it as this, and that's how they draw on other sources among people that are not them, that have not been called by God. And yet they still have to figure out life, and they have to figure out who God is. Just like right now, I don't have God coming here and handing me a piece of paper explaining everything. So I feel like they have had to struggle with understanding God's characteristics, God's the desires for the kind of people and creatures we need to be, and how we relate to the other parts that God has created, the animals, the plants, everything. And I think this is how they're evolving in that way. And I'm not saying Noah, I'm not saying the Noah story is not real. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just saying that I feel a connection to them, to these people who are so struggling to try to figure out where God is and how did they get here and what is the deal. And because I think that's what we all are doing, and everybody has been doing forever and ever, trying to figure it all out. Maybe I'm off on a sidetrack, but anyway, that's kind of how I was looking at it.
No, I think that's very well put, because for centuries we have pointed back to 5 covenants, because they are key moments when we have, that God has revealed God's self to us, and it's places we can take a sense of security and comfort in. So I think that's absolutely beautifully put. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to be respectful of our time. Thanks for coming, Donna.
Yeah, see you guys next time.
See you next week. Any final thoughts from anyone who would like to share? Bueller? No. Well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate you coming. We'll be here next week discussing the Abrahamic Covenant, one of don't mean this to sound flippant, one of people's favorites. It's one of mine. Natalie, our director of youth, will be teaching, and recent seminary grad. We're very excited to have Natalie lead us next week. So that'll be 7 o'clock. We hope you will join us. Please tell your friends. I know there's a lot going on in the church and a lot of conversations, but we would love to get the word out about this. Tomorrow night at 7:30, we're having a service for lament and prayer in a prayerful and worship response to what's the conversation, the events that are affecting our community and our nation around racial injustice and protests. So that's at 7:30. It will be live streamed on the website, just like a 11 a.m. worship. So thank y'all all again, and we will see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.